Got it.
Yeah.
Oh, are
Well,
we streaming
yeah,
live?
we're live. Welcome everybody
Nope.
to New World Chaos. Another episode, another day, still alive. And today's gonna be pretty philosophical. Um, it's me and Jeff. I'm Nemo, kind of just the usual crew, and Neil, as many of you may recognize, and a guest we've had here before, Rich. Today was Rich's idea. We're gonna be kind of just moseying through casually on the book, The Tao of Pooh. And yeah, it's going to be very might be difficult to talk about and articulate in words. Well, I guess
That's
we'll have to
pretty
see what
funny.
happens and just go with the flow. Um, Rich, do you want to start with any like brief little introduction or whatever is kind of coming to mind right now for you?
Yeah, first thing that like springs to my head, I think we need to clear something up straight away, and whether it's the Tao of Pooh or the Tao of Pooh, discuss because I'm not sure.
I'm looking it up now. I am not a poo expert
It's,
This is
it's
the official
pronounced Tao.
podcast.
because I need to type it into social media. Let's see.
Because
So
Neil, like you've lived in China. Why
Yeah.
would it be two different
It's
words?
the Tao of Pooh. Tao.
Okay, so when Chinese was translated into English originally, it was done by um, uh, Wade Giles, two people, Mr. Wade and Mr. Giles. They came up with an English language version of Chinese pronunciation. So that used the letter T to make the sound, which is actually a D sound. So you'll see things written such as TZI in some expressions and just ZI in other expressions. The more modern way of writing Chinese with the English alphabet would use the letter D, and the old way would use the letter T. But the actual Chinese word is Dao, which means path or way. So the modern version is probably phonetically closer to the Chinese way of speaking. The other thing that changed in that period was that when Wei Zhao's put it together, it was still the Qing dynasty, the Manchurian Empire, and they used classical Chinese as a way of writing and maybe the way they spoke. Whereas after Mao Zedong took over China, he simplified the written language and the pronunciation changed to be more like the Beijing accent, which they now call Putonghua, which means standard speech. So there's been a change in the general accent, and there's been a change in the Chinese written system, and there's been a change in how we write Chinese with English letters. So T became D over time, but the word itself is still pronounced Tao.
I'm so glad we have you here. I guess
yeah, this is huge. I always thought that whether it was spelled with a D or a T was somewhat interchangeable, but the pronunciation was closer to a D sound. Tao of Pooh.
Pretty much it, yeah.
So, speaking of Tao of Pooh, hi, Rich.
I guess first things first is to kind of like briefly outline the book, and it was written by a dude called Benjamin Hoff, and in its basic form, he set out to write a book explaining the Tao through the lens of Winnie the Pooh, and kind of seeing the way Pooh bear, a very simple bear, a very little brain, kind of expressed himself in line with the Tao. And I think, unless anybody else has got anything to add to that, that's a very brief, simple explanation of the book. It's a book that I read, I think, late 20s, perhaps early 20s. I can't remember, a long time ago. And it was really inspiring back then. So I thought it'd be a good thing to revisit now with you guys.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I read it when it came out. It was the year after I moved from China to America. And I studied some Taoism and Taoist martial arts like Tai Chi and Xingyi when I was in China. but didn't really understand Taoism. And then apart from the yin yang sign that I'd seen and didn't understand it either. And then I was like, read some proper books about Taoism, as in sort of more like philosophical, religious type of books, and couldn't really grasp it either. And then read that, I was like, oh, okay, that's what it means. So for me, it was like the simplest, clearest, cleanest explanation of Taoism, and it made sense of all the other experiences as well.
I could tell you my experience with Taoism. I had a friend that I had to quit hanging out with because you couldn't talk to him about anything. Everything was the Tao. And no matter what was going on or what your problems were, you just need to tune into the Tao. You just need to tap it. Everything was the Tao. And that's what, and so it really turned me off of the concept. I don't know what this Tao is, but it was very annoying to hang out with.
Tao worshippers. I
But I
find it
love,
very un-Taoist that the Chinese government in modern day banned Winnie the Pooh. So the whole thing is wonderfully ironic.
I did not
I
know that
did
happened.
chuckle when I heard that. Sorry, Neil. What?
So I
because
didn't know
he
that
looks
happened.
like Pooh.
Yeah, so it was
It's
a bit of a
so
vanity project.
this day and age.
Yes.
We got down
Yeah,
to it.
there's a true absurdity of the modern day. Uh, I think when I think of uh, Taoism, the Tao of Pooh, and kind of I was listening to the audiobook earlier to be ready for this podcast, and I have to say one of the experiences or themes that really came up for me that's not explicitly described this way in the book, but is really relevant, is the way that a lot of people attach acceptance to positivity. And so they seem to conflate these two things as the same thing. And some people will reject it and others will embrace it. So those who embrace it will tend to try to force this kind of positivity if they're mistaking the two concepts, and those who reject it will then force negativity. And neither of these is getting to this like radical acceptance that's just, as they might say, the way, the path, and just allowing things to be as they are.
Definitely a certain, for me, it definitely, for the book, I guess there's an optimism there, and it's not a kind of mindless optimism either. And I think it actually says in the book like optimism will serve you well, and definitely I take from that like pessimism will not help you build things; it will only tear things down. I can't remember where I read that somewhere. I don't know whether that was in the book or not. I could be wrong. And in the book about positive, one thing I remember about positivity was the snowball effect. And one of the lines he says is about kind of like pushing the snowball down the hill, but depending on what energy is behind the snowball is what happens at the bottom of the hill. So obviously, if you're like being optimistic about this snowball, it's going to go down the bottom of the hill and make a snowman. If you're being negative about it, it's going to smash into your car. So, yeah. So, what was the other thing you said? You said kind of like optimism or like kind of positivity. What was the other one?
Well,
Acceptance.
it's the whole idea is attaching positivity to acceptance or mistaking the two concepts. So then some people like embrace it and others reject it. And so you have people that are either trying to force positivity or people that are like Eeyore attached to negativity. And to me, it seems like neither of those gets to the depth of radical acceptance and letting go that is not very conceptual. That's a very experiential way of living.
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying there, that like positivity as instead of acceptance is almost forcing the issue. Everything's going to work out all right. Everything's going to work out all right. Whereas acceptance is, I guess it's such a simple word. It's kind of hard to describe it, but it's just allowing things to be as they are and being okay with that, even if those things are not positive in their outcome. Accepting things being not working out is as right a position as taking as accepting things that do work out. And
I know it is
so
reality test. I think of it as reality testing. Like I try to be as reality based as possible, so I'm always trying to figure out what's going on here. Like that's real. That's not my PTSD or not my projected trauma or just normal natural projections that come from being human. What is the actual reality here? So that's my default, is to seek that kind of baseline reality and try to make sure that it's actually reality that's matching what's in my head.
well,
Yeah,
that to me sounds like Taoism.
Is it? Well, then I've already. Maybe that's why I don't understand it, because I already do it. What can you tell us what Tao is of Pooh?
Um, I've, there's a really good bit, Rich. What do you think about the vinegar tasters near the beginning of the book? That's a really good. So I'll step in for this bit. There's a famous Chinese painting called the Vinegar Tasters. It's a painting of three men tasting vinegar, and each one has a different expression on their face. The first person has a sour look on their face, so vinegar tastes sour to them. The second one has a bitter expression on their face, so the vinegar tastes bitter to them. And the third person is smiling, so the vinegar tastes good. So in this painting, the vinegar represents life. And so the first person who has this sour look on his face is Confucius, who's the classically is probably the oldest philosophical position in China, comes from Confucius. So Confucius was believed that heaven and earth were out of alignment with each other, and that in order to be in alignment with heaven, you had to follow these very strict rules and regulations and rituals. So life was sour because it was not in alignment with heaven. The second figure, the figure who tasted life as bitter, it represents Buddha. And Buddhism often describes, well, the first tenet of Buddhism is that life is suffering. So hence it's bitter. And then the third character is Lao Tzu, the so-called founder of Taoism. I say so-called because no one really knows for certain where Taoism comes from. But Lao Tzu's position is that that harmony exists naturally between heaven and earth, and it can be found by anybody at any time. So life is a representation of heaven. That's the position that Taoism takes. So that harmony is always in existence. And a bit like when you drop a cork into a river, it will just go with the flow. And if you go with the flow, then you're in flow, you're in harmony with heaven and earth. And it's resistance to that movement, resistance to the current, resistance to the stream, which causes disharmony in life. If you think about trying to swim against the stream or swim against the current, no, it's really bloody hard work, and you don't really get anywhere, and you get bashed around a lot. Whereas if you just float, it will just take you.
I have a question. Two questions. How do things get done or built or constructed or directed? And how does that relate to creative flow, which is what I search for, what I help people try to find for their healing? It like there's this passive life flow where you kind of just let life take you, but is there a creative version of that where you're engaged in something active and you're directing it towards something constructive? Would it have a relation to that?
Try this one, and I will try, because it's really kind of goes against the kind of idea there wasn't kind of explain it intellectually. So I'll try and kind of be slightly abstract. I know it's a bit of a cop out, but I'll try.
No, that makes sense actually.
You asked like how do things get done, and there's a line, I can't remember exactly what it is. Neil, if you've got the book right in front of you, it's about I think it's something like nothing gets done or something like that. Something, if you can find the line, that'd be ace. But it's basically, it's not like you just kind of sit down and everything happens how it should. Say there's something that needs to be done. You need to walk the dog. You just go walk the dog. That's all you do. You don't do anything else. You don't put roller skates on the dog to make it go faster. It's about doing what needs to be done but not pushing it. You don't try and fit the square peg in the round hole. So it's a very, I don't know whether that made much sense. It's really kind of difficult. For creative flow, it's very much finding that quiet. There's a lovely line in the book that reminds that was kind of that was a quote from somebody else, and it says, I did write it down, 1 second. Music is the space between the notes. And I love that quote, and it's so right. If you turn on like some obscure death metal that's just like full on, and it's just noise. Yeah, exactly. It's just noise,
Sonic
double
Youth.
bass pedals.
That's what I used to do. I grew up with Sonic Youth, and I would listen to their white noise, and you would hear there were like entire cities and worlds in that noise.
If you took like the drums out, say, and then you just heard the guitars and the bass and the vocals, and then that would be a different kind of creative melody altogether. But it's the gaps in the middle of all this noise and the gaps in the middle of your life, I guess, that you find these creative moments. I think that's what they're trying to say.
And
Okay,
go on,
that made sense.
Nima. See you.
Yeah, I
First.
really want to try to answer what Jeff's questions were, because this is really my bread and butter here. Even if my answers don't end up making sense, it's a lot of fun. But this is the way that I would articulate it so that language can do the best it can to transmit an actual experience and not just be this intellectual thing. So you have multiple layers to your experience in your daily life. Maybe there's thoughts that come and go, there's more intense thinking and less intense. It's like waves. There's also physical experiences. You have five senses, so there's always things you're seeing and hearing. And all these different layers kind of become this crazy amalgamation, and we sort of just experience it without necessarily noticing and separating all of it. It's impossible to focus on it all at the same time. But one of the ways I describe this total radical acceptance and letting go is that underneath every other layer, there is this bottom layer where you're just present and here totally. That is like this basic reality. And in between, here's like your little surface level stuff, kind of what you're doing, like what we're doing now. We're really focused on it. This is our experience, and this is what you're most aware of. And then there's all these little things in the background you're not really paying attention to. Somewhere between this bottom layer and everything else, for most people, there's resistance. There's something in you that, and not all the time necessarily, but you're feeling shitty, you're in pain, you're depressed, or you're angry, enraged, whatever. And so there's these tough emotions to deal with, or physical feelings, and the instinct is to get away from it or try to resolve it and just feel better. It's like this instinct to seek pleasure, avoid pain. But the difficult or negative feelings are not necessarily the resistance. It's like this separate thing you can feel. Are you resisting what is here and now, or are you allowing? Are you holding on tightly, or are you flowing with it? So everything else you experience is possible with or without that resistance, with the resistance or with flow.
In
The let
varying degrees, like
Yeah.
there's a degree of resistance and flow at any given moment.
Yeah, it's almost, and there is a point where it becomes almost disorientingly paradoxical because a lot of people, when they start to discover this or something clicks, they still have these habits of resisting, and so, and then it gets entangled with their decisions where they don't even know how to take action without resistance being part of it. So it's almost controlling. It's almost like authority. And so they try to get rid of their resistance. Like, oh, I'm resisting. I totally get it. I'm gonna be with the Tao. And they just like try too hard. And then it's kind of contradictory. It's like trying to dig yourself out of a hole. Whereas the way of seeing resistance dissolve is to be with it. So then it's a radical acceptance of the resistance itself.
I think about I just say I think about Pooh gets stuff done, right? In the books, in the Winnie the Pooh stories, Pooh gets stuff done, but the way that Pooh goes about doing it isn't the way you'd probably think about doing something. It just kind of happens as he kind of stumbles through. So there's, I think the difference between going with the flow and being passive. The difference is if you want to get something done, there's a way to get it done by going with the flow, and there's a way of getting done by trying to force it. So it's not about being passive. You still have aims and things to do and get done, but perhaps the way you go about it is different, and the way you go about it is with less resistance. And that might even be things like, I really need to get this book written. And so you might think, right, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to make myself write this chapter tonight, which is kind of forcing it. But what you may actually be feeling is, I really want to watch TV and relax. So if you were to go with the flow, you might sit and watch TV and relax, and as a consequence, have a great idea about what to put in the book, which you might then write another time when it feels right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't do anything that feels like work. Like, it all has to feel fun, creative, and like play. It has to be something that I would do whether I got paid for it or not. Just because I like doing it so much. And that's the state I try to achieve with work.
Well, that sounds very Pooh Bearish, doesn't it? I mean,
I think I am. Yes, I'm vibing with the Tao so far. I am thinking about what Nemo said, the resistance. In relation, two things. In relation to the autism, where we have that rigidity, where it's not us resisting, it's just neurologically we can only push ourselves so far in a direction. And I'm also thinking about Dabrowski and positive disintegration, and just kind of letting it all fall apart and disintegrate. But there's that part of you, that third factor, that developmental potential, kind of under the surface, that it's disintegrating around, that emerges. So I guess that's my version of the Tao, or a Western version of it. But it's kind of that baseline that I find inside of me. Emerson talks about this too, with self-reliance and that concept. But I think I have some analog to the concept in my own personal experience, and I think with the autism, it maybe modifies it a little bit when it comes to the resistance part. But I think I'm aligned so far.
Yeah. Some people get really carried away intellectually and they get lost. Where, I mean, there are people that they might end up fasting, for example, and say, well, I'm just not going to resist hunger. I'm just going to feel it and experience it. It's like, okay, we're still alive. We're human beings. We have a nature, which is also described in the book. And, eating food does not mean you're resisting it. It means you're choosing to do something because you're alive and you need to eat food. As a parallel to like your reference of having neurological differences with autism.
Might me of kind of like talking about resistance is a physical kind of manifestation of resistance that's not exactly kind of conscious. Sticking with Taoism, and we're going to hop, skip, and jump to Tai Chi. Neil, I know you've practiced Tai Chi before. I don't know if you other guys have ever seen it, but there's a standing practice, and Neil's going to tell me if I butcher this name, called Zhang.
and wrong, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So it's basically just standing practice, so you stand still. And it's a centering kind of thing, and I won't go into it, but one of the physical manifestations that most students have when first trying this, you get your legs shaking and kind of like, it's hard work standing still. I know that sounds silly. It's damn hard standing still. Your thighs ache. But one of the kind of resistance to this kind of method you get is a student's shoulders will lift and you will tense up. And the point is to relax. And so there's that's what popped into my head as like a physical manifestation of like resistance to actually just stand there, just stand still. That's what you're told to do. Just stand still in this posture And
I
the
couldn't
body,
do. My body couldn't stand. I never stay still. it's I don't think that part of the Tao I would be successful at. It sounds like a Tai Chi sounds like a nightmare where you have to move really slow in these tightly controlled, precise motions. That's the exact thing I can't do.
Jeff
I
standing
can't
still
slow
is just in the
down, and I
fifth
can't
dimension.
coordinate precise movements.
Jeff, you're standing still. You're just in a different dimension than us. So in our dimension, it doesn't look like standing still.
Oh well,
No, I don't know.
I think
Yeah,
I could do the mental part, maybe the physical part. Not there'd be some challenges there, but I think mentally and emotionally. And you mentioned because we talked about the physical resistance, but I think when you say resistance, you're meaning more psychological or emotional or mental
um,
resistance.
I no, I think it's a very physical experience a lot of the time. Physical and emotional, and really emotions are pretty physical.
Yeah, I think
So
it's
that
all.
yeah.
I'm whole person oriented, so it's all one thing to me. That's why I
Yeah.
can't separate my thinking from my emotion because I use all the parts of me to do it.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, well, with Tai Chi, which I almost always say Chai Tea, um, there's a that's I don't remember which way this goes. Either Tai Chi is one of the types of Qigong, I think that's what it is. Otherwise, it might be the way around. But I do Qigong, and that used to be one of the practices I did a lot to cope with chronic fatigue. And there's these things that are just they're physical practices. They're so simple and people overlook the simplicity of it. They think keyword that it has to be complex, challenging, difficult. So it's kind of a strange, ironic thing. It's like people seek things that will bring up that resistance in them, almost like they want a challenge of man versus himself. When a lot of the practices are really simple and they don't appear very challenging at face value because
very
it's
sorry.
well, it's more I think it's almost more challenging to deal with that simplicity because it's mentally not very entertaining.
Very for I guess for a Westerner, if it's it's in contrast to what you learn. Say you've done some physical sport, and say let's take karate or something like that, and it's very hard, and it's very exactly, and it's very physical, and then you're told to do tai chi, and you're told to kind of move slowly and flow, and it's just it doesn't compute. First of all, for me at least, it just keep my teacher kept telling me, you need to relax, you need to relax, look, you're not relaxed. And so after a while of being beaten, then you learn to relax, or at least try. Yeah, so it's that's something you've got to get over as well. So that it being kind of physical, mental, and emotional, that whole one thing, I could definitely see that.
I also know it
But
as grounding, which I have much difficulty with. I'm a neurotic, high anxiety Westerner, and I have a very hard time grounding all of that. But are there Tao techniques that help with emotional grounding or any kind of grounding?
Yeah, breathing,
Oh, I hate that.
Hmm.
like consciously
So
breathing.
much coordination and discipline.
It,
Actually,
it,
I mean, look at what we were talking about with Pooh, Winnie the Pooh, like how he does things. He bumbles through things.
I
He
can do that.
honestly, in a lot of ways, is kind of a fool as a character. And I think that is a wonderful way to do things, is that so much of life we're kind of the fool and it's chaotic and it's physically awkward. I felt that a lot in my life. I had a lot of physical limitations, and so I've always been kind of the awkward, bumbling fool. But just embracing that and accepting that, almost like your personal hero's journey is this artistic falling down the stairs.
Right
It's
off the cliff.
yeah, yeah, just embracing that is like that is how it is, rather than trying to make it something that is going to be expertly done and graceful right away. It's like pretty much anyone who can do anything we would call graceful, at least the examples that come to mind for me, is actually really physically intensive, but the outside appearance of it to us, like ballet dancers, music performance, appears kind of weightless. And as a musical creator myself and a musician, when you start out, you tend to, similar to like how Rich said, learning Tai Chi, you tend to tense up because you just don't have the ability to maneuver yourself physically and stay relaxed. You don't, it's like you become more literally physically controlling because it's just you don't have the physical intuition to do it in a lightweight manner. But as you practice, you continue to let go and you start to learn that literal muscle memory in the form of how to do it in a way that's actually relaxed. And I think that's an archetype that applies to like almost everything. The whole point is that it's really uncomfortable and it's awkward and sometimes painful and messy, but you accept that's how it feels rather than trying to fix it.
If you practice something like playing the guitar or archery, which is a very coordinated skill. Let's stick with the music one. So let's say you're learning a musical instrument, and you start off by being quite tense and trying to imitate specific movements, such as the chords, the right places to place your fingers to hold the chord, or the right way to hold drumsticks to play the drums. So you start off with a mental conception that you're trying to make your body do physically, and it's quite a tense experience. Um, over time, you practice and practice and practice, and you repeat and repeat and repeat, and until your mind is no longer involved in the process, until your muscle memory does what it needs to do without you having to think about it. At which point, you'll probably find you're actually doing it whilst relaxed. So you start in tension when the process is from thought to body to some form of action, there is tension. Once your body knows how to do it without the thought, it happens in a state of relaxation. And that's when you're in tune with, you're naturally able to play the guitar or naturally able to play the drums. You've trained yourself to do that, but what you're achieving is actually a state of being in tune with yourself or in flow with what you're doing. So in the case of in this book, they talk about a concept in Taoism called the uncarved block.
The what?
Which is the uncarved block, like a block of wood that you haven't cut anything into, making a shape out, and it's actually pronounced Pooh. So good for Winnie the Pooh, right? And Winnie the Pooh represents the uncarved block. And what the uncarved block really means is original simplicity, which contains natural power. So Winnie the Pooh is this representation of simplicity, but with that simplicity is all the natural power that comes with just being in tune with yourself. What we attempt to do, particularly in a Western sense, in the fact that we use our minds a lot, is we try to create the image here and then make the body become it.
Mm-hmm.
And the process of being in tune with the Tao, so to speak, is really getting beyond mind. So you're no longer using your mind, but you're allowing it to happen in a relaxed and natural state. That probably sounds a bit circular, doesn't it?
No, I related to it very much in painful detail. I have dyspraxia. It's right there in the word, dyspraxia. And when you're describing how to learn an instrument, that's the exact thing I could not do as a kid. That process that it takes to build that muscle memory for me is like 1,000 times more difficult and longer than an ordinary person because I don't have the processing to coordinate those muscles. I was probably 10 or 11 when I learned how to use a fork. I was longer to ride a bike after, like, I was years behind everybody else on riding a bike. I cannot use chopsticks to this day. People have taught me 100 times. It will not build the memory. So I understand everything you said from not being able to do it and knowing, like, trying to get to that state, but knowing the limitations I have that keep me from getting to that state. Now, I did manage to learn to ride a bike. And I can get on a bike to this day, and it just happens. It just takes over. Like, so I did build it in some things, but the process of me building it is a lot more intensive than it is for the ordinary person, to where it's almost not worth doing. So that's all
How
I
did
was.
you?
And I'm dissociated. I haven't felt my body in 10 years.
Yeah, yeah. I've definitely had experiences with dissociation for sure, especially when there's a lot of physical input. But with this dyspraxia thing, how did you start to respond to that throughout your life? Just the fact that this was one of your challenges.
That's probably the one that pains me personally the most. The autism doesn't affect me at all. It affects other people and they react to it. But when I'm by myself in my apartment, I don't even notice it. I notice this dyspraxia all day long. It's also called developmental coordination disorder. I'm clumsy. I drop things. I bump things. I'm constantly bruising. I cannot. People ban me from their kitchens. They won't even let me in their kitchens when they see me try to cook and use kitchen equipment. I'm dangerous. I have the coordination of a toddler. I'm not kidding. And that's the part of my disability that I actually feel and experience every day as a disability. And that's about the only part of it that seems disabling to me.
Yeah, I have a lot of similarities in experience to what you're describing there. And I actually a lot, if we're talking about a lot of this Tao related philosophy, pretty much all of the remarkable experiences and challenging and painful experiences I've had that really transformed my life were very physical and becoming just a more balanced person. And it's a really tough transformation. Like thoughts can change very quickly. Emotions may be somewhere in between. Physical things change slower. It's more intense.
Is this
And
physical stuff like trauma or physical challenges that you took on deliberately to embody
uh
justice?
my my trauma is really tied to the condition I was born with and also tied to the messed up childhood I had. And so it all just kind of compounded on itself. And because it was so developmentally intense, it had this like long-term damage on me by the time I started to seek my own therapy and healing and all this stuff. So the physicality, the results of that were really intense. The metaphor I use with people is I was basically the boy in the bubble. And
Oh,
so doing physical things is just really intense. And then I also was trying to survive work. So it was really hard to get a job when I was first moving out. And then most of the jobs were grueling, low paying. They were extremely labor intensive. I was not used to that at all. So it was just like surviving this freaking military boot camp practically. So there's this kind of, I mean, I don't know if maybe that a little bit relates back to some of the Western Eastern differences that Rich and Neil were talking about with hard sports versus, say, Tai Chi. That there's this like intense, just do it, get it done, rub some dirt on it, walk it off, suffer through it willingly. It's like willingly, it's almost, I don't know if it's a Western thing, it might be not quite just Western, but like this intensive, hardcore embracing of really brutal things as a way of transforming yourself and enduring hardship. I don't know. But yeah, it's very, for most people when they experience those things, it definitely builds resistance in them. And they just sort of force themselves to get through something. So they sort of miss the point that way.
Got a really interesting sort of set of parallels coming up with this. So some of the martial arts, some of the Chinese martial arts I've studied are what would be called external martial arts. So that's things like praying mantis kung fu. Um, yeah. Or some of the Japanese ones like ninjutsu and jujitsu. And they would be an equivalent to um, athletics or what we would describe as Western sports, where you're you're building strength in your muscular system. So that's the external part. And you're using your muscles and your coordination. And this sounds very similar to what Jeff finds so challenging is being able to coordinate the muscular system in a very specific function repeatedly, precisely. So in Chinese, they're called Wei Gong or external effort. And then Tai Chi, which is the Taoist martial art, as is And so Tai Chi is actually a martial art. It's a lethal martial art once you learn to use it properly. Qigong is also Taoist, and they're both called internal or Neigong, internal arts. So that's about allowing your energy to flow. So in Tai Chi, the reason that you relax the muscles and don't tense the muscles is because the strength and the power comes from the flow of energy within your body rather than from training the muscular system and having this sort of precise coordinated movements. There is precision in the movement, but the precision comes about through relaxation, not through effort.
Yeah, it
So it
feels
looks on the outside one way, but what they're doing internally is something
It's
I
different.
may be able to do.
And so that also makes me think about an internal locus of control, the internal martial arts, the inner nature, in a way, then external locus of control, the external effort, the external martial arts, the muscular control. And one of the things that is noticeable is that people that train in the external martial arts or any external sport, they have a lifespan. You know, you're not going to remain a professional tennis player at the age of 65, right? Because your muscles just won't do that. You won't be as fast, you won't be able to react, you won't be as strong, you won't have the endurance. But if you look at people that study the internal ones, they get to 95 and they're stronger than they ever were. And they will throw you around like a rag doll, and you just don't want to step up to that at all. So there's the internal energy and the internal flow, what comes about through relaxation and learning to tune into yourself lasts so much longer and just continues to grow in strength. Whereas so that's the internal locus of control. That's tuning into your inner nature, the strength that's always within you, from that you're born with and will always be there. And it's about learning to access that. Whereas the external stuff is about external locus of control. You're trying to control your own externality. So that begins with mind and ends in body. The internal stuff is about letting the mind go and arriving in the body, which I think in Winnie the Pooh, owl represents the Western minds most of all. Okay? It's all up in here. And rabbit, busy, always running around doing things. But what's great about Pooh is he doesn't really think about anything because he doesn't have brain, or he doesn't think he has brain. And he doesn't really go about doing anything, but things get done. And he's probably just chasing honey the entire time, right? That's of course because that's what calls to his inner nature. Bears love honey, right? So that's what he does. He just goes with his nature. So and it's an interesting exploration for anyone, is to try to find out what is in me, what's the power within me if I don't imitate others, if I just try to be me. So a way to kind of think about this is what am I being called to do rather than what have I been taught to do. So the education system is an external locus of control. The education system tries to frame you and shape you and make you fit a certain way and do a certain way and be in a certain way. But entrepreneurship, as a different example, is normally best undertaken by people that have rejected the education system and just followed their heart. And I think when Jeff mentioned always wanting to try to find his creative flow, I think that is following your heart. I think that may be your inner power, Jeff, your natural inner being, is when you tune into your creative flow, you're tuning into your power, to who you really are. And maybe that in those, when you're in those moments or periods, because I don't know how long they last, I'm predictive about that, but then you're probably at your greatest. And I think we all are. I think we all have that within us, and it's not to be taught to us by anybody else, and we don't find it by imitating others.
It's that
the
flow
most difficult
state.
thing to do is to let go of the mind and listen to the heart and listen to the body, and that will probably guide us anyway. hopefully will lead us to honey. That's the way I that's the way I was
You make it
thinking
sound
about
so
it.
easy, and it is if you just do it.
Yeah.
But that's the trick, isn't it?
Yeah, you just do it. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's the
Sorry.
trick. Is the hard part of it is actually recognizing who you are as an individual and like kind of listening to yourself, because there's so many opportunities for somebody else to come along and tell you who you're supposed to be or what you're supposed to do, and that's all too common, I think. And it's just kind of that's the hard part, really, is just kind of listening to yourself. Interested, Nemo. I think you mentioned like one of the Western kind of things was, I think you said just do it, just get on with it, just do it, and that's kind of like part of the I did one of the concepts in the book, which is Wu Wei. Believe I pronounced that right. It was always explained to me as just do it. Don't mess around. It's just the right amount of effort to get the job done, and we as humans usually try too hard. And just do it. We're going to get sued by Nike for using their logo, but just do it. But that's an amazingly hard thing to do.
Yeah.
I had a mentor tell me one time that she says always say yes until someone stops you or gives you a reason not to. Like, get in the habit of just saying yes to everything and pushing those little boundaries until somebody comes in and tells you no or stops you. It's certainly what I do.
I'd
Yeah.
agree with that as long as it feels right to say yes.
Yeah. Be a yes man, like that Jim Carrey movie. Um, yeah, with just do it, that's a good example of how language does not transmit very well because people have these physical habits that are attached to language. I think that's what makes it so hard to describe things. Like, I still meet people to this day that literally their mind thinks that thinking is all they are. They don't make any differentiation between thinking and being alive or being present so that they'll say things like, as long as you're alive you can never stop thinking. And I didn't even know that there are people that believed such a thing or that their minds would get so carried away until I was like 21. So I guess I was oblivious to that and I was in my own world. But a lot of what we talked about today reminds me of Eckhart Tolle and some of his work, which is not really labeled under any particular philosophy or spirituality, but relates a lot to, I guess, Taoism and Buddhism, probably. And so that's pretty relevant to a lot of what we're saying. The phrase "just do it" when Nike applies it is it's associated with this grin and bear it and willingly suffer through things. So it's sort of like this paradoxical embracing your own resistance, but that tends to lead people to reinforce it and then create more resistance. And they have no idea they're even doing this. Whereas for the Tao of Pooh, just do it, or Wu Wei is probably more of a focus on simplicity and just allowing yourself. Actually, when Neil was talking, I was thinking about how different physical things feel as you experience it. And the Tao way of experiencing or doing things physically feels more like your inner energy is coming through and is leading. So it's almost like it's pushing up and out. Like, I do yoga where I have this routine that's really good for chronic fatigue, and I still do it these days. It feels awesome. Feels good to stretch. But the whole point of it physically is that the breathing leads the way. So you breathe, and that is what propels your movements, almost like you're a human windmill. And that feels like this energy is coming up and it's leading the way. So it starts with the energy or your chi. Whereas the way of doing things that's more external, maybe even forced at times, it's almost like you're trying to pull your energy out of you. And that almost seems like that is man versus himself because you always start with your energy. So if you're trying to pull it out of you, it's almost like this pushing and pulling are in contradiction to each other. I don't even know if that makes sense, but that's like I have this sense of it.
It did to me. I'm also thinking like this whole podcast started from saying yes. You and I met on a Discord server. We're like, hey, I'm in the community building, so am I. Let's collaborate on something. Okay, yes, let's do it. And here we are. So that's the kind of stuff I think of when I think of just do it or say yes.
Yeah, and every episode we have this little buffer, for before we go live that kind of we can just adjust and go with the flow, and that's really nice. But honestly, this podcast is very unplanned. It's very minimalistic compared to a lot of the things I've done. And ta-da! Jazz
I
hands,
love it.
it's working.
When it gets too complex, I'll probably have to leave, but I love it for now.
Yeah.
I love the more down home style.
Mhm.
Kind of
Seems to work.
that was the irony of me kind of like thinking about this podcast and going, right, I said to you guys earlier on, and like, how are we going to do this? I don't know. Oh, I'm going to go through every chapter of the book, going to pull everything apart, going to deconstruct everything, and we're going to get right to the nub of it. We're going to understand what everything's about. And I'm like, I'm being owl, I'm being rabbit. What am I doing? And in the end, I've got it in front of me. I've got, and to be honest, I am taking like little bits, lines. I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. I'm going to keep that. But most of it is just knowledge for knowledge's sake that doesn't need to be here at all. I can just close this down and not care. And now I've got YouTube open. I don't want that. Oh, I've done something wrong. So yeah, it was just stupid. But we should have just gotten here, and what we're doing now is brilliant. We're just talking.
I do have two questions about Pooh, though. Can you talk a little bit about Eeyore and Tigger? Because those are two characters I very much identify strongly with.
Eeyore is difficult. He thinks he's kind of, well, he is. He's in the book. He kind of professes to be. I'm not sure I should use this word. The part of the intelligentsia.
Oh, yeah.
He's well educated and stuff, but he tends to be very, very cynical about things. And he is, and I mentioned this earlier, he is basically critical theory. he uses lots of big words to try and confuse or try and make you, I guess, in a way, belittle the other characters, so that they're not as smart as him. But he's very negative. And I don't know if anybody wants to expand on that in a minute. But if I go over Tigger quickly, who's probably my favourite, and he's got a lisp in the thing. I knew he had a lisp. He's quite funny. But he's just like, Tiggers can do anything. And he doesn't know his own limitations. And I think that's kind of, there's a lot of people that don't know their own limitations, myself included. And so, yeah, that's what those two characters kind of personify for me anyway.
And his energy. Like, I know in the autism community, there's people that relate to him, and he was one of the first representations with somebody with an overabundance of energy, and like I have said, it was in a positive way. So you could be like Tigger. Tiggers are wonderful things, and it helped to destigmatize that part of me.
Yeah. Yeah, I've always been pretty passionate myself, so I definitely know what it's like. And there's different ways that this, sense of intensity and passion and energy comes up where other people don't seem to know how to handle it.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, a lot of that I think is just um, kids need to play and they're really driven to play, full of energy. This is almost to some degree just a childhood thing, it's a human thing. And we just don't have good outlets for that. There's a lot of resistance to that. But uh, if I could throw in a couple of observations, if we're going with like metaphors for different characters from Winnie the Pooh, I don't know if this is really all that related to the book, The Tao of Pooh, or kind of that lens, but I like to think Owl represents, at least we're talking like the school system, Owl represents baby boomers in academia, and Rabbit represents a little bit Gen X, and what was the last? Oh, Eeyore represents millennials. That's like that's like the trajectory I see. Just because it started with Eeyore, because he just seems like he has to cling to pessimism and misery. It's not even just that he's depressed. It's like Pema Chodron actually talks about this. She's one of my favorite philosophical, spiritual people, and she says a lot of people, because they hate the feeling of groundlessness, free falling essentially, they want to concretize. And if they can't concretize something as positive and convince themselves it's going to be okay, it's good, it's great, whatever, then they're going to concretize into making it negative. And that's basically what Eeyore does. When you listen to him talk, he has to convince himself his house is going to get blown over by the wind in a storm because it's more comfortable than just not knowing and going with the unpredictability of life.
It's a really interesting take, um, particularly as Pooh's character is the one that doesn't know and doesn't seem to have a plan. So Eeyore in some ways holds that opposite where, like you say, things are definite. They're definitely bad for Eeyore, but there's maybe some reassurance in them being concrete, as you said it. There's a really beautiful part in that book where it's Eeyore's birthday. So Pooh decides to take Eeyore a jar of honey because that's a great gift. And along the way, he forgets where he's going and what he's doing, but realizes he's got a jar of honey. So he eats all the honey. And when he gets to the bottom of the jar, he remembers that it was actually supposed to be for Eeyore.
Oh,
Meantime, Piglet also wants to get a gift for Eeyore's birthday. He gets him a balloon, and he wants to get there before Pooh because he wants Eeyore to think that he remembered it was Eeyore's birthday and not Pooh that remembered. So Piglet's running along with the balloon. Meanwhile, Pooh's sitting eating honey, and Piglet trips over and bursts the balloon. So by the time they arrive at Eeyore, by the time they arrive at Eeyore's home with his birthday presents, they've now got an empty jar and a burst balloon, which kind of sums up what Eeyore's expectations might be anyway. So Pooh says, "Oh, I've got you this jar. It's great for putting things in." And Piglet says, "I've got you this balloon, but it burst. But at least now it fits in the jar." And as they leave, Eeyore's happy, putting the balloon in the jar and taking it back out again. And I thought that was one of the most beautiful parts of the whole book. Actually, is that just seeing Eeyore happy, because I think we've all got Eeyore in us. We've all got a propensity to feel depressed or to feel things are at a loss at times, and I suppose that the characters in these books, they take an aspect of people and then they create an entire character out of that singular aspect. So it makes it so much clearer to understand. And yeah, I as a kid, I always wanted to kind of like hug Eeyore. That was my thing. I was like, I don't like him feeling sad. I want to make him feel better. But that's his character. He finds himself in that negative view, doesn't he?
what is Piglet archetype?
I always thought of Piglet as nervous and well-meaning. I guess it just seems
A
Well,
little
like
bit.
he's worried about things going wrong, and he's trying harder than Winnie the Pooh.
Is he anxious? Like anxious, anxiety? I know a lot of piglets like that.
He also has a kind of. I was just thinking about that. He also has kind of got a very insecure nature about his physical
Yeah.
quality of being a very small animal. But there is another book after Tao of Pooh, is the Tao of Piglet, which I read ages ago, but I can't remember what it's like. I did talk to a friend about it, and he said it's not as good as the Tao of Pooh. So I can't comment. I'd have to reread it, but I can't really remember whether
it's the virtue of being small, or the virtue of small things. So Piglet represents virtue.
Yeah, like
Um,
I remember a couple of pieces of the or the Tao of Piglet. I never read that one, but I've seen a lot of it referenced before. And the thing that I remember from it is that they go into how Piglet can represent compassion. That, essentially we're all vulnerable and we put in our best effort, and part of our vulnerability comes through more intensely when we really care and we want to do something good. And, there's this risk that it might not happen, it might not work out. And then in a way, though, Piglet also can be this sort of opposite to Winnie the Pooh, going with the flow, because Piglet tries so hard that he makes it more likely something's going to go wrong, or he sort of ends up self-sabotaging himself because he's trying too hard. He's so concerned or afraid of that vulnerability that it makes him clumsy, or kind of things fall apart. But he's like this endearing character still. I almost sometimes like look at Piglet the way that I imagine some crazy, larger, mystical being would look at humans. If some being, whatever, fifth dimensional alien, whoever it might be, was looking down on Earth at humans, I'm pretty sure that they would just look at us as Piglet. And maybe they might look at us similarly to like all the characters in Winnie the Pooh.
have you ever heard of the expression like it's the little things that count? That's Piglet.
Yeah, well, sometimes the little things that get you in trouble too. Sometimes
This is
Yeah,
also true.
little
Yeah.
things can do all kind of things.
yeah. Uh, I had something else and I lost it. I got too enthralled with Piglet. Oops. Yeah.
Well, we are
Oh,
at the Oh, go ahead.
Eeyore. It was about Eeyore. His character also. Dang it! Now I lost it again. Why? Oh my God! It was so specific too. But it was something
Well,
about when Rich was, or Neil. You were saying that you wanted to hug Eeyore as a kid. Um,
Hmm.
I don't know. Damn it. I'll remember it later.
well, maybe it'll come back around. We are at the hour mark. We only have a few viewers today, but if there is anybody out there that wants to join us or hop on the Zoom or interact in the comments, this is the time to do it. And you can email us at jeffandnemo@gmail.com, and we can send you a link to join us on the Zoom.
Yeah.
Okay.
There
Rich,
was
do you
something
have
that
any? Oh, go ahead, Neil.
I was going to say, unless you had a question there.
No, no. Go.
Okay. There was something that I didn't get. But the first time I read the Tao of Pooh, my focus was on trying to understand what Daoism might mean. And there's a there's a saying that goes along with Daoism that says that is um, anything that can be expressed as the Tao is not the Tao. So it's something that inherently can't be spoken of. There's that sort of it's that mystical aspect to it. So I always kind of focused on what is Daoism, what can I get from it. And then it's experiential, it's being in tune with oneself, all this other stuff. And that's pretty much all I got from the book. But when I read it this second time round in preparation for this, the thing that stood out for me the most was individualism. Well, probably two things, individualism being the primary one. And what I really got from Daoism this time round was being yourself, expressing yourself, acting in a way that feels right for you,
Mhm.
and not being led, directed, or controlled or informed by others. And I
Yep.
didn't get that the first time round at all. And it felt very meaningful this time round to kind of get that message. Especially as sovereignty and autonomy and self-determination have become for me the most important and imminent, like present things in my life. So to really get that believing in the power within us, not imitating others, things will happen in the right way at the right time, just by being yourself. this having faith in yourself. I mean, that's what I really got from the book this time. And then the other thing that I got that I wanted to share was a link to Sufism. And I don't know if you guys know anything about Sufism. It's kind of, it's nested within Islam, but has its roots in Zoroastrianism, which is like a pre-Islamic religion from Persia, from Zoroaster. Basically, within the Tao of Pooh, there's this bit where it says, from caring, from the heart, from caring comes courage and wisdom. And courage, from the French, means from the heart. And it talks about mind and heart being connected in this way. And in Sufism, they say that the mind is the surface of the heart, and the heart is the depth of the mind. So both these kind of esoteric philosophies, religions, I don't really know what to call them. Maybe they don't need a name, but they express something identically, and to me very beautiful, which is that when we think from our heart, when the mind is the surface of the heart, then we think with what comes from in here, and that is courage. Not courage as in sort of bold-faced bravery, but the courage to be yourself, and the courage to live your way. And the other thing that comes from the heart is caring and loving. And the message I got from this, and then it's probably just me getting this message because I wanted it, is that that being caring and being loving is an act of courage, but it's also a natural act for all of us, that our inner nature is to care. And I think of Pooh Bear as being a very caring character. So that's what I got this time around. Very different from trying to understand Chinese philosophy, right? I arrived at somewhere very different this time.
That's interesting, the individualism. It must have come from the Pooh part, the Western part. Where were some of the places that you located it?
Within the context of Daoism, or within the book?
Yeah, in the book. Or either one. I'm interested if it's in Taoism too.
I guess, well, from Daoism, I'd say that the individualism comes from knowing or recognizing that you are in harmony with the world, with heaven and earth, as would be described in Daoism. And that harmony is your natural inner power. So it's already individualistic because it's your natural inner, and it does, and also not to imitate others, but to be yourself. So if everyone is doing that, we are all being very much individuals, and being an individual is the way to be in harmony with yourself, and therefore in harmony with the greater nature of things.
Why does it feel so contentious all the time? Like as the more you individuate or like claim your individuality, the more it brings you into conflict with the collective, I guess.
I guess perhaps the way we in the West. Okay, so this is a fundamental difference between Eastern and Western beliefs and philosophy systems. The West, we like to compartmentalize. We like to divide things into components. You know, the concept of the atom. You know, the final thing that was not divisible, coming from Greek. So we put things into boxes in order to understand them. We categorize things, and we do that because I think fundamentally because the sort of Western belief in how things come to be is that maybe like God created the earth, God created the world. So there is already a dualism, a division that exists inherently in Western thinking. And dualism is quite a deep part of Western philosophy, whether it's Greek or pre-Greek. If you go to Eastern philosophy, the shared concepts that underlies Eastern philosophy is that everything exists, came into being of its own. There's no creator in the Eastern philosophy. The universe is an energy that came into being by itself. And everything else subsequent to that, downstream from that event, planets, people, animals, everything else, is all coming out of this one thing, not a dualism, but a unity. So the individual and the collective are the same thing. In an Eastern concept, they're the expression of the same thing. Whereas because in the West we have this dualism where this sense of needing to categorize things, then we separate them. And then the individual becomes something that's become separate from the collective and potentially in conflict or rivalry to it, rather than recognizing that the individual and the collective are expressions of the same thing. So it should inherently be in harmony with one another.
It's not there's obviously something wrong either with reality or with that construction, because it doesn't matter. That's not what we see in the West. We see individuals competing with each other at the expense of the collective, or in contrast to the collective. I don't see it working the way you described in the West.
Well, there's a
I
lot of
think
conflict right now. There's so much conflict in, say, like the United States right now. There's this massive cultural upheaval, so it might be really hard to understand some of these ancient philosophies in comparison to the particular crazy storm we're dealing with right now, because so many of us are inside of that storm. I could probably take a stab at one aspect that I think makes it confusing, in that, in my experience, a lot of people around me that are Americans or have lived here for a very long time, etc., they're relatively Western, they will act as if they're highly collectivist and anti-individual. So then they're already putting these two forces in conflict with each other. You have to choose one or the other. And so they it's like they try to be selfless and they end up becoming self-hating and self-attacking, and then that affects how they treat others. So in their desperation to be collectivist and anti-individual, I've noticed that those people also tend to be the most destructive with actual communities and community building. So they tend to try to force it. I don't even think they realize what they're doing. So in a way, I guess we're trying to tie this together. Those people have a lot of resistance, and they're resisting the fact that they're physically an individual in this body, alive, etc., and that that's a physical reality. And they're resisting the fact that they have a self and trying to get rid of it. And it doesn't come out as very supportive of groups and community. It comes out as almost attacking communities. So, I mean, I don't know, that's my experience where I think people try one thing and there's so much resistance and there's so much messiness and BS in them they haven't dealt with, that whatever they're trying to do doesn't actually get there on the outside.
But I think what Jeff is pointing out is exactly the consequence of the Western philosophical position. What Jeff, you're saying, you're seeing individualism and collectivism in conflict with one another.
Yeah, and
And
just
I
what
think that,
Nemo said about how our
yeah,
culture almost seems to set up that conflict, because you're set
but it
up to
does.
rebel against the existing culture. It doesn't support like individuality as an outgrowth of an existing religious or family culture. You have to rebel
No,
against it to become an individual.
well,
You have to
that's
reject
exactly the point. Yeah, that's the point I was making, is that in the West, we have this dualism. So we separate things. So we separate the individual from the collective, and then they become things that are in competition with one another. So that's what we're experiencing and seeing, because that's the philosophical position we take for existence.
Mhm.
Whereas the Eastern philosophical position is that the one and the many are the same thing, and one is emergent from the many. So collectivism in the East seems to work a lot better. But also, if you were to go to somewhere like China, you'll see that people are highly individualistic. They're very much everyone just being themselves, and at the same time, the collectivism works. Whereas for us, these are kind of ideas in the West, these are ideas in conflict with one another.
But you're
you're
saying
either
not in
one.
reality.
Well,
Like
I'm saying
if
that
we didn't
reality.
conceive it that way, then it would be a natural. In reality, it would be a natural outgrowth. But because we see them in opposition, it doesn't
We
look that way.
experience them in opposition. Yeah. We think about them in opposition. We act them in opposition. We politicize them in
But it
opposition.
doesn't have to
But
be
we
that
don't
way
have to
if
be
we
that way.
shift our mental reality around it.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. We should, and that's, I think that's something that we actually are trying to do as a group and as an extended group is how do we create communities based on the values of sovereignty and individualism where we work together. So what we're kind of doing is trying to heal the rift between individualism and collectivism without losing either.
I don't want
Yeah.
the collective part. The communal, the community part I want, but I don't
The
want the
communal.
collective
Okay,
part. I'm
yeah.
never going to be when it gets to a certain scale, it's like the community, the communal becomes the collective, becomes the, or is it gazelle shaft instead of Gemeinschaft? And that's the part where I have to jet and go find something on a smaller scale. So I associate collective with large impersonal, de-individualized groups, and I don't want. I'm not trying to build collective at all.
That's very Western of you.
Well, I am Western.
Yeah. Yeah, I've actually I've
Me
never
too.
really understood like what Neil is saying in this whole part of the conversation. I never thought it made sense for people to try and demand you choose between the individual and collective as if they're literally in opposition to each other. I thought that was bizarre because the individual is literally the building block of all groups. So why would you want to be anti-individual if you care about building groups? And that's a question that to me is a response to the collectivists that I know because they tend to be dogmatic and authoritarian. They want to force it on people. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's why it's such a conflict here, is because it's if you're anti-individual, that translates to being anti-autonomy. And so then there's this they associate this relationship between interconnection and authority. And usually when you're pushing authority, people will instinctively rebel against it. So then Jeff was
Oh, yeah.
referencing this kind of pattern of rebellion that happens with people leaving their families behind and pushing that away. And so and you look at the school system, a lot of kids grow up hating learning because they try to divorce competence from autonomy and then attach it to authority. So many kids will then just instinctively rebel against learning because they think of it as work now, not play. But this is so conflict oriented. It's so force based. It's like aggression. If you want to use some of the terminology, like in the Tao, it's resistance. It's not going with the way.
I think it's a really nice thing to notice in what Jeff said around wanting community, not collectivism. And if you think, when I think about community, I think about communication as having a root, a shared root in their meaning. So when individuals communicate with each other well, you have community. But a collection of things in my mind, collectivism and collection, I just think of like marbles or I don't know, Star Wars toys, or it's just like getting everything and bunching it together.
Yeah.
And that's very different from community in that it's not about communication. It's not about individuals sharing and meeting and creating. It's just about bunching everything together and then just calling it one thing. And so if I think about collectivism in that way, I find myself very much against it as well. And I think about communication between individuals, forming community. I'm very, very, very much for it. In fact, I mean, the worst case scenario would be to be the only person in the world. So that would suck so bad. Having no one to talk to, having no one to play with, no one to laugh with, or no one to shout at, like whatever emotion needs expressing. It only really works when there's someone else to express it to or with, or get some feedback from, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm with you, Jeff, completely on that. The collectivism and community are not the same thing, and I think that it's really important to understand the difference. Yeah.
Or I
Well,
think
I
of
wanna,
go on, Jeff.
oh, that's exactly what I was gonna say. Was I wanted to give Rich a chance to give any last minute thoughts. But
I
go
was
ahead.
going to say, whenever I think of collectivism, just to kind of jump on this bandwagon, is that it's bad. That I get negative kind of connotations from that word, and it's probably something to do with the Borg,
Yeah.
maybe. But and then of course there's all the connotations of like communism, etc., and all the bad shit that's going on now with this kind of collectivist attitude. And one thing or one line that keeps coming back to me recently in the past year or something is that we are individuals, but we live in a community. And I mean, I work for a charity, so my kind of bread and butter is to work within the community. That's one of the buzzwords is community cohesion, even though I hate buzzwords, but there you go. So yeah, I'm totally on board with the kind of disapproval of the word, the collectivism kind of idea. Community.
That's
Yeah.
four of us so far.
Yeah. Yeah, if I could use a metaphor, kind of playing off of Neil using metaphors, community would be like, say you have a bunch of potatoes, you have a bag of potatoes. Maybe these potatoes are alive and conscious and all that. So they're self-organizing potatoes. Collectivism that's really anti-individual, the way that I've encountered collectivists, they want to take those potatoes and beat them until they're mashed potatoes and say, look at the collective and how wonderful it is. We're all part of the collective. But it's like those mashed potatoes are, if we're going with the idea these potatoes are alive, when you turn them into mashed potatoes, it's literally just mass murder until they're a pile of mush. It's a horror story.
That's a great one. That's one of the best metaphors I've
Yeah, I
heard.
don't think we're gonna that we might as well end there. I don't think we're gonna do better than that
Can't
after.
stop that.
Okay. Yeah, go put some googly eyes and some potatoes and let's make a stop motion film for the future generations. We'll reenact 2020's events
In
with
mashed
potatoes.
That's our moral message for tonight.
We'll have to do a video literary journal.
Yep. I don't know. I'm sure somebody's going to protest and complain and say that
I'm ready for them. Come, Jeff and
We're-
Nemo at gmail.com. Send it there.
we're not accommodating to people on the paleo diet. Low carb. Potatoes. Too many carbs. Too starchy. Or
Well,
it's
Rich,
plant
I-
abuse.
I absolutely enjoyed this. My mind is so expanded right now. I need to go process. Thank you so much.
Pleasure to be on here once again. I am actually melting as well. It's so hot here.
Oh my, do you have a fan or anything? We just went through our heat wave a few weeks ago and it was hell. We broke our record 3 days in a row.
I keep looking at my face coming back at me. I'm like, oh my God, I'm sweating. I look terrible.
You need a person there with a fan to fan you or something.
A dog, I could get it to wag its tail at me, but I don't think it's going to help.
Nice. Yeah, the air conditioning does not reach my bedroom, and this is where I am with my cool tapestry. So we have to be sweaty for our sacrifice to the podcast.
Maybe you could ask yourself, instead of what would Jesus do, what would Pooh do?
Yeah.
Go with the flow.
Or just do what Satan would do and get comfortable with the heat.
Instead of saying, one of my friends, instead of saying, get your shit together as a phrase, his phrase was, get your poop in a group. It's still one of my favorites. I just imagine these little cartoon poops just like singing Ring Around the Rosie, dancing in a group. It's ridiculous. I'm like, yeah, that's the epitome of my goals in life.
I think I was wrong. We did find something else to end on.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you, everyone. As usual, we're at jeffandnemo@gmail.com. We have a Discord server you can join. We have a Zoom you can hang out on, and we'll be here. Are we doing it Saturday, or are we gonna coordinate that later and figure it out.
Either Saturday
Oh,
or
by the way, I'm
eventually.
moving Friday, so Saturday I don't even know what my. I think that's all gonna be up in the air. So we
Sure.
should just talk on Discord.
To be determined. Yeah. Eventually, we are changing days, so
So we'll
potentially.
let everyone know. Just stay tuned. You kind of know where to find all of us. So,
Yep. It's been awesome.
Rich, once again, thank you, Neil.
Yeah.